Hello and welcome to First Post. With me is Dr. K.V. Subramanian. He is an executive director at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Before that, he was the chief economic advisor to the government of India. Apart from being an accomplished economist, he is also an author, and his latest book has come out. It's called India at 100, Envisioning Tomorrow's Economic Powerhouse. Dr. Subramanian, very good to see you.
So good to be with you here talking, Palki.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And let's start this conversation with your own story. You had a modest beginning. I believe that your father had to abandon his education because of financial hardships, and that is where you started from, and you've made it to where you have. In a lot of ways, it mirrors the growth of India's middle class, post-liberalization, post-1991. How would you say the economic reforms some 30 years ago impacted your growth and your personal story?
So it's true, Palki, and I'm glad you brought it up. My father lost his father when he was 7 years old, and he could only go to school, finish school. He wanted to study more, but he couldn't, and therefore he made sure that me and my younger brother were two siblings. He gave us, education and ensure that I was the first person in our entire clan to go to university. So in that sense, it's been quite a, it's really nice. Every time I actually, I'm able to contribute, I think of him because it's, in some sense, living his dreams as well. So in that sense, I think the liberalization was a very, very, I would say, seminal moment. I remember reading about liberalization, sitting in the reading room at IIT Kanpur, and in fact, that was my first exposure really to economics and, drew me into economics. And I think there is absolutely no doubt if you look at the macroeconomic level, it's made a big difference. I'll, share a telling statistic. If you looked at the GDP per capita that India had in 1947 and now it's identical. 9,000 rupees was the GDP per capita, in 1947, 3.3 rupees to the dollar. So it was about 2,730, which is exactly what it is now. That essentially, now in between, I think that's the story of liberalization. From 2,730, we brought it to $300 per capita, by 1991. So lost, 9 times as much. And then we've retrieved that back now to 2,730 similarly. So just think about it. Over a 75-year period, we basically, through the Nehruvian socialism, we managed to actually lose almost the entire of that economic whatever was left after the British left. So from there, I think from 300 to now 2,700, 9 times, increase in GDP per capita. That to me is really the benefit of liberalization. If there's one theme I take about and actually which should resonate with everybody, all policymakers, is the importance of competition. What liberalization did for us is competition. I think no better example than the media itself. Think about the time when there was only one Doordarshan, where we used to tune in and today, and I think the competition has brought out so much, right? So all of you competing and really, healthy competition actually enhances capabilities. So that to me is really the thread that I want to, latch on to and hopefully resonate. And across the board, whether it's actually take our competitive examinations, industries, anywhere, where there's healthy competition that builds capabilities that actually enhances overall welfare.
Right, and we do have the quota system, but that's a different sort of, I think, we'll need a full conversation on its own. Sure. The way you put it, from where we started in 1947 to the point of liberalization and now, you're also looking ahead.
Yes.
Your book envisions India becoming a $55 trillion economy by 2047, which is a very good goal to have, but very ambitious as well. And for our viewers, let me put this in perspective. The US is the biggest economy at this point, a little over 25 trillion. China is second at 17. We are 3.3 in 2024. Yeah. And you're saying we'll be 55 trillion in 2047. What is it that makes you so optimistic about India's potential?
So I'm sure, Palki, you and the viewers would have observed, I always make any of my assessments based on rigorous data and economic analysis. Let me start by giving a couple of examples. Let's take Japan. From 1970 to 1995, a 25-year period, the Japanese economy actually grew in nominal GDP dollar terms by 25.6 times. In 1970, its GDP was 220 billion. By 1995, it was $5.5 trillion. If you take China, and I didn't give China as the first example because people will say that's not a democracy, but Japan certainly was. So China from 1996 to 2021 grew its GDP by 22 times. That is the power of compounding. Over a 25-year period, compounding really works. And what I am, talking about here is about a 16 times increase in India's GDP. And let me lay it out for the benefit of the viewers. If we take 8% growth, and I think that is where the ambition really is, I'll expand on that. 5% inflation, which is what has been there historic, if you look at from 2016 onwards, post the inflation targeting regime, that is despite COVID, despite the Ukraine war and the supply side problems. So I think it's very reasonable to assume, therefore, that 5% inflation should be there. I think it may be conservative, but very reasonable. So 8 plus 5, that's 13% in nominal rupee terms. Now, I estimate based on, the difference, change in inflation, that the rate of depreciation of the rupee going forward will be less than 1%. It has been about 3.5% historically, but I'll come to and I'll explain why. In the book, I estimate it's 1%. Now, because depreciation reduces the value in dollar terms compared to rupees, you have to subtract that 1%. So 13 minus 1 makes it 12%. Now, at 12% rate of growth in dollar terms, your GDP multiplies every 6 years. This is the rule of 72. So, 72 divided by 12, 6 years. Over a 24-year period from 2023 to 2047, if GDP multiplies every 6 years, there are 4 doublings. That's 2 into 2 into 2 into 2, which is 16 times. That's basically what I'm talking about. And I'll explain this in even more detail. In 2023, India's GDP was 3.28 trillion. Let's approximate it 3.25. So the 4 doublings means from 3.25 to 6.5, that's your first doubling. 6.5 to 13, that's your second doubling. 13 to 26, that's your third doubling. And 26 to 52, which is close to the 55 trillion. Now, this is where the power of compounding can be illustrated. If on the other hand, GDP grows only at 9% in dollar terms, then GDP multiplies only every 8 years, doubles every 8 years. So over a 24-year period, you don't get 16 times multiplication, you get only 8 times multiplication. This is what, Japan and China actually saw. They grew at very high rates in dollar terms during their 25-year period. So we need to seek inspiration from that. And I think India can. If you look at historically, India has grown at about 7% in real terms. So 8% is a stretch goal. And I've kept that stretch goal so that we have that ambition and we can deliver that 8%. In other words, the rest of it actually is not as critical as the 8% growth. Let me just spend a minute on explaining why the rate of depreciation is likely to be lower. So if you look from 1991 onwards, the rupee has depreciated on average by about 3.5%, annually. Now, this has been during a period where India's inflation has been about 7.5%. Now, one of the fundamental credos in international economics is that if a currency faces higher inflation, its value in purchasing power terms actually erodes faster, right? For instance, to explain, say, to make sure things are understood very well, if I have 100 rupees in my pocket today, with 5% inflation, I can buy only 95 rupees worth of goods or services next year. If you take the US, where inflation is 2%, $100 worth of money in the pocket can buy $100 worth of goods and services now, but only 98 next year. So the 5% inflation is eroding value of the rupee much more or much faster than that of the dollar. When inflation was 7.5%, it was eroding even faster. And that is why one of the fundamental aspects, therefore, is that higher the inflation, higher the rate of depreciation. Conversely, therefore, lower the rate of inflation, lower the rate of depreciation as well. So a fall from 7.5% inflation, which is what has prevailed in the past, to 5% now with inflation targeting regime in place, will shave off at least 2.5% on the rate of depreciation, which is why I think actually the rate of depreciation will be about 1%, not 3.5%.
Right. You've done your math, obviously. There are a lot of assumptions there also, and there are a lot of variables. When we're looking at a 25-year projection, then obviously a lot can change.
So let me just intervene. Actually, say I wouldn't say assumptions, Palki, in the sense that I'm building everything ground up. Not just that, I've also tested the framework for previous 25-year periods. Even, for instance, the 8% growth that I've talked about, actually in one chapter, I've devoted an entire chapter to looking at the investment rate that, what investment rate and what productivity can deliver. So everything I'm building it grounds up. In some sense, rather than sort of just being superficial and making an assumption about the growth rate itself, I am building it from more,
No, when I say assumption, of course, it has basis in your understanding of the subject and so on and so forth. What I'm trying to say is that even in the last 10 years, if you were to look at this 10-year period, India has seen stupendous growth. We've emerged as a force to reckon with on the global stage. But there have been challenges. There has been a pandemic, which no one could have foreseen, and the disruption was immense.
Tell me about it.
Right? There have been 2 wars, 32 conflicts at last count that we've seen across the world. We've seen climate crises, we've seen geopolitical tensions.
Indeed.
So there are challenges as we, as a country, chase this 55 trillion target. What, according to you, is the biggest threat to India's economic ambitions?
No, I think that's a very good question, Palki. Let me again draw on the example that I gave you, of Japan. As I said, Japan's GDP multiplied 26 times from 1970 to 1995. Now, this was not a honeymoon period for the economy. There was the Vietnam War. There was the oil shock, which led to hyperinflation in the United States, double-digit inflation, and therefore growth was impacted. In fact, that kind of inflation the United States has not had ever since, even during COVID, for instance, and following the Ukraine war. So Japan actually managed to grow its GDP 26 times despite these challenges. I think there is an important lesson in there. If you take China as well, which I gave the example of, it's multiplied its GDP 22 times. It did that during this period where there was the global financial crisis. There was also COVID. So I think whenever one looks at a 20-25-year period, headwinds will certainly be there. Equally, there is also possibility of tailwinds. That's the balance that you have to keep in mind. I would rather not focus only on the headwinds. I would say there are both of them. From the perspective, because you've asked me about this, the headwinds that I see, I think there are a few. Certainly, climate change is one, and I've written about it. Therefore, there is the possibility of already we are in there, the deglobalization, and I think as a result, the impact possibly on some of our exports, and also industrial policy actually changing tack in many of the advanced economies when they're facing competition. So those are actually, I think, potential headwinds that India will have to face. But here I'll give you an example again, one more. So when I think about the potential that I'm assessing about the Indian economy, I think about how Sunil Gavaskar assessed Sachin Tendulkar's potential in 1993. At that time, Sachin had played cricket for about 4 years and he had performed. Based on that performance, Sunil Gavaskar said, if he does not end up with at least 30 international hundreds and 15,000 runs, I'll be very disappointed. In a similar way, based on past performance, I am assessing India's potential. No claims to be Sunil Gavaskar of anything, let alone cricket.
But you're saying India will be the Sachin Tendulkar.
India will be the Sachin Tendulkar of the global economy. And the important lesson here is, it's not as if Sachin did not face challenges. He had the tennis elbow surgery. He had to, bat at a different position during Greg Chappell's, So there may be self-created, there may be, other challenges. But I think the important point is he worked hard and, creatively worked to overcome these challenges, which is what India will have to do as well. Any 25-year period will obviously not be just a straight line. There will be challenges, headwinds and tailwinds. But I think the important part is we should keep our focus on delivering that 8% growth. And across 27 chapters, I've laid out what are the policy steps we need to take. If we do that, I have absolutely no hesitation in saying that we can, counter those headwinds, utilize the tailwinds to deliver this ambition.